The rain hammered against the blacked-out windows of the Air Ministry building on November 14, 1940. As Dr. Reginald Victor Jones stood motionless in his cramped office, staring at a map of England covered in pencil marks and calculations. Outside in the darkness, air raid sirens were beginning their mournful wail across London. But Jones wasn't thinking about the bombs that might fall on the capital tonight. His mind was fixed on a city 100 miles to the northwest, Coventry, where at this very moment 500 German bombers were converging with a precision that should have been impossible. They were flying through thick clouds and complete darkness, yet they would find their target with an accuracy that defied every principle of aerial warfare that military commanders understood. They would do this because they were following something invisible, something that most of Britain's military establishment still refused to believe existed. Radio beams, invisible pathways through the sky that guided enemy bombers as surely as railroad tracks guide trains. And Jones, just 28 years old, was one of the few people in the world who understood exactly how they worked. What made this night different from all the others, what made the rain-slicked map on his desk seem to pulse with terrible significance, was that Jones knew this raid was coming. British intelligence had decoded German communications. They had tracked the alignment of the radio beam transmitters on the coast of occupied France. They had identified the code name Moonlight Sonata. They knew the target, the timing, the scale, and they had made a decision that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. A decision about how much to interfere, how many lives to save, and how much knowledge to reveal to an enemy who still didn't fully understand that their secret weapon had been compromised. As Jones listened to the sirens and thought about the people in Coventry, unaware that their city had been selected for destruction with scientific precision, he felt the weight of a war that was being fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with mathematics and electromagnetic waves. This was the invisible war, and tonight, people would die because of decisions made in rooms like this one. Decisions based on calculations about radio frequencies and antenna patterns and the terrible arithmetic of intelligence work, where saving lives today might cost even more lives tomorrow. Jones picked up a photograph from his desk. It showed a strange antenna array, captured by reconnaissance aircraft flying over the French coast. To most observers, it looked like an ordinary radio mast, but Jones had spent months learning to see what others missed. The spacing of the antenna elements, the angle of the supporting structures, the careful orientation toward England, these details told a story. They revealed a system so elegant and so deadly that when Jones had first proposed its existence, senior military officers had called him delusional. Now those same officers were making decisions about how to counter a threat they still didn't fully understand, and Jones was the only person who could explain it to them. The photograph trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, though he had every reason to be afraid. The tremor came from exhaustion. He had been working 18-hour days for months, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, and the desperate knowledge that every hour he spent solving technical puzzles was an hour that bought someone somewhere a chance to survive. The science that had once been pure intellectual pursuit, the radio wave theory and antenna design that had fascinated him as a doctoral student at Oxford, had become weaponized. Every equation he solved, every frequency he identified, every countermeasure he developed translated directly into human lives saved or lost. The telephone on his desk rang, cutting through his thoughts. He knew what the call would be before he answered. It was the operations center, confirming that German Pathfinder aircraft were now crossing the English coast. The raid was beginning. The beams were active, and somewhere in the darkness above the English Midlands, the invisible guide rails laid down by German radio transmitters were doing exactly what they were designed to do, leading bombers to their target with mechanical precision. Jones had deployed countermeasures. His team had positioned their own radio transmitters to interfere with the German beams, to bend them, to introduce uncertainties that would cause some bombs to fall wide of their intended targets. But the orders had been clear. Don't reveal too much. Don't jam so effectively that the Germans realize we've broken their system. Let some bombs through. Accept casualties in service of the longer game. It was the logic of intelligence warfare, cold and calculating, and absolutely necessary if Britain was to survive. But it felt like murder. What Jones couldn't know, standing there in his London office with rain drumming against the windows and sirens wailing in the darkness, was that the story of how he had arrived at this moment? How he had discovered and countered Hitler's radio beam weapons would become one of the most significant intelligence achievements of World War II. He couldn't know that his work would save thousands of lives, protect critical industries, and buy Britain the time it needed to survive the darkest period of the war. He couldn't know that the techniques he was pioneering would become the foundation for electronic warfare, a new form of combat that would shape conflicts for generations to come. And he certainly couldn't know that in pursuing the mystery of the radio beams, he would stumble upon something far more dangerous. Evidence of German rocket programs and nuclear research that threatened not just Britain, but the entire world. All he knew in that moment was that people were about to die, that he had done everything within his power to minimize the casualties, and that the war he was fighting, the invisible war of frequencies and antennas and electromagnetic deception, was far from over. The rain continued to fall, the sirens continued to wail, and over Coventry, 500 German bombers began their attack, guided by beams that Jones understood better than the Germans who had created them. But to understand how Jones arrived at this terrible moment, to comprehend the full significance of what he achieved and what it cost, we need to go back. Back to before the war, before the bombs, before anyone imagined that radio waves could be weaponized with such devastating effect. We need to understand who Reginald Victor Jones was, how he developed the skills and knowledge that would make him indispensable to Britain's survival, and how a young physicist with no military training became the tip of the spear in a conflict that was as much about science as it was about firepower. Reginald Victor Jones was born in September 1911 in Dulwich, South London, into a world that was about to be transformed by radio technology. His father worked as a sergeant in the Grenadier Guards, a position that provided modest comfort, but hardly suggested that young Reginald would grow up to advise prime ministers and change the course of history. From his earliest years, Jones exhibited the qualities that would later make him extraordinary. He was curious about everything, particularly anything that involved taking things apart to understand how they worked. His mother learned not to leave clocks unattended. His father learned that the boy who asked endless questions about why things happened was actually listening to the answers, processing them, building mental models of how the world operated. At school, Jones excelled in science and mathematics, but not in the way that many gifted students do, by memorizing formulas and regurgitating them on exams. Jones wanted to understand principles. He wanted to know not just that something worked, but why it worked, how it could be improved, what its limitations were. His teachers recognized something special. This wasn't just a bright student. This was someone who thought like a scientist, who approached problems with a combination of rigor and creativity that couldn't really be taught. In 1929, Jones won a scholarship to Wadham College, Oxford, to study physics. Oxford in the early 1930s was an extraordinary place for a young scientist. The golden age of physics was in full bloom. Quantum mechanics was revolutionizing understanding of the atomic world. Radio technology was transforming communications, and universities like Oxford were at the center of it all, places where brilliant minds gathered to push the boundaries of human knowledge. Jones thrived in this environment. He studied under Frederick Lindemann, an eccentric and brilliant physicist who would later become Churchill's chief scientific advisor. Lindemann recognized Jones's talents immediately. The young man didn't just solve problems. He asked better questions than most of his professors. He saw connections between different areas of physics that others missed, and he had an intuitive grasp of practical applications that was rare among theoretical physicists. Most importantly, Jones developed expertise in what seemed at the time like an esoteric specialty: radio frequency physics and antenna design. In the 1930s, radio was still relatively new technology. Broadcasting was becoming popular, but the deeper physics of how radio waves propagated, how antennas directed and shaped electromagnetic radiation, how signals could be focused and controlled, these were frontier questions. Jones became fascinated by them. His doctoral research focused on infrared radiation and its detection, but he spent countless hours thinking about radio waves as well, about how they bent around obstacles, how they reflected off the atmosphere, how antenna design could shape and direct them with precision. This knowledge, which seemed purely academic in the peaceful years of the mid-1930s, would become desperately important within a decade. But Jones couldn't have predicted that. In 1936, when he completed his doctorate, his primary concern was finding a research position that would allow him to continue exploring questions that fascinated him. He took a position with the Admiralty, working on the detection of aircraft using radio waves, early radar research. And it was this work that would ultimately bring him to the attention of British intelligence. By the late 1930s, as war with Germany became increasingly likely, the British government began trying to understand what scientific capabilities the enemy might possess. This was new territory. In previous wars, intelligence had focused on troop movements, battle plans, industrial capacity. But modern warfare was becoming increasingly technological. Aircraft, submarines, radio communications, chemical weapons. Whoever had the technological edge might win the war, regardless of how many soldiers they could field. The question was how to gather intelligence about enemy scientific developments. Traditional spies could photograph documents or observe military installations, but understanding cutting-edge physics and engineering required actual scientists, people who could look at a photograph of equipment and understand not just what it was, but what it implied about the underlying research, what it revealed about enemy capabilities, what threats it might pose. Frederick Lindemann, now serving as Churchill's scientific advisor, recommended Jones for this kind of work. In September 1939, just as Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, Jones received an unexpected summons. He was to report to the Air Ministry to meet with Air Commodore Nutting, who had a proposition for him. The meeting took place in a nondescript office in London. Nutting got straight to the point. "Dr. Jones, we need someone who understands physics, radio technology, and scientific methodology to help us understand what the Germans are developing. We're receiving intelligence reports, bits and pieces, intercepted communications, photographs from reconnaissance flights, technical details from various sources. But we need someone who can look at these fragments and tell us what they mean, what the Germans are actually building, what threats we need to prepare for. This isn't traditional intelligence work. This is scientific detective work. Are you interested?" Jones was 27 years old. He had no intelligence training, no military experience beyond his current Admiralty position, no background in the kind of work Nutting was describing, but he understood immediately that this was important. If war was coming, and it clearly was, then Britain needed every advantage it could get. If his knowledge of physics could help provide that advantage, then he had an obligation to contribute. He accepted on the spot. The initial weeks were bewildering. Jones was given an office, a secretary, and access to intelligence files that contained a chaotic mixture of valuable information and complete nonsense. Spy reports from the continent, some reliable, many completely fabricated. Photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft, showing German installations that might be important or might be decoys. Intercepted radio communications in code that had sometimes been broken, sometimes not. Technical documents captured or stolen. Authentic or planted disinformation. Jones's job was to sift through all of this, to separate signal from noise, to identify patterns and draw conclusions about German scientific capabilities. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle when most of the pieces were missing. Some of the pieces were from different puzzles entirely, and the picture on the box was intentionally misleading. But Jones had the right mind for it. He approached intelligence analysis the same way he had approached physics research at Oxford. Develop hypotheses, test them against available evidence, revise them when new data contradicted them. Always be willing to question assumptions. Most importantly, he learned to ask himself not just what the intelligence report said, but what they revealed about the people who had created the systems being described. What kind of scientist would design equipment this way? What technical constraints would have forced these design choices? What capabilities did this imply about their research and development programs? In October 1939, just weeks into his new position, Jones encountered the first hints of what would become the most important investigation of his career. A British scientific intelligence officer in Oslo, Norway, received an anonymous package. Inside was a technical report, handwritten in German, describing various secret weapons projects under development by the Third Reich. The report covered guided missiles, remote-controlled gliders, radar systems, and something that caught Jones's attention immediately: radio navigation systems for aircraft. The document was extraordinary if it was genuine. It described in considerable technical detail research programs that, if successful, would give Germany enormous advantages in aerial warfare. The question was whether it was authentic intelligence or sophisticated disinformation designed to mislead British preparations. The Oslo Report, as it came to be known, created fierce debate within British intelligence. Some analysts believed it was too good to be true, a German trick designed to send British research down false paths. Others argued that the technical details were so specific and so plausible that no one could have fabricated them without genuine knowledge of the programs being described. Jones studied the document carefully, paying particular attention to the sections on radio navigation. The report described systems that used radio beams to guide aircraft to targets with high precision. The technical approach described was ingenious. Directional radio transmitters would broadcast narrow beams. Aircraft equipped with appropriate receivers could follow these beams like invisible roads through the sky. Where multiple beams intersected, pilots would know with certainty that they were over the target. To Jones, this made perfect sense. The physics was sound. Directional antennas could indeed create focused radio beams. Aircraft receivers could detect them. The main question was whether German engineers had actually built working systems, or whether this was still theoretical research. Jones wrote a memo arguing that the Oslo Report should be taken seriously, particularly the sections on radio navigation. He pointed out that the Germans had strong motivations to develop such systems. The Luftwaffe's strategy relied heavily on bombing, but bombing accuracy at night or in poor weather was terrible. Pilots literally couldn't see their targets. If the Germans had found a way to guide bombers with radio beams, it would revolutionize their capabilities, allowing them to bomb with precision regardless of weather or darkness. His superiors were skeptical but noted his concerns. Jones filed the information away and continued monitoring intelligence reports for anything that might corroborate the Oslo Report's claims. In the months that followed, small clues began accumulating. A crashed German bomber was found to have unusual radio equipment that didn't match known communication systems. Intercepted Luftwaffe radio traffic occasionally mentioned terms that seemed to reference navigation systems. Reconnaissance photographs of German-occupied territory showed antenna installations with characteristics suggesting directional transmission. None of these fragments was conclusive on its own. But Jones began to suspect that the Oslo Report had been accurate, that the Germans had developed operational radio beam systems, and that Britain was in serious danger. The breakthrough came in June 1940. By this point, France had fallen. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe was preparing for a major air campaign against Britain, designed to destroy the Royal Air Force and soften up the country for invasion. And British intelligence captured a German prisoner, a Luftwaffe crew member, who during interrogation made an offhand reference to beam flying, a term he used casually. as if it were common knowledge among German air crews. The interrogator, not understanding the significance, almost didn't include it in his report. But the reference made its way to Jones's desk, and he immediately recognized its importance. Beam flying. The prisoner had confirmed what Jones had suspected. German bombers were using radio beam systems operationally, not experimentally. They were flying along guided pathways to their targets. Jones urgently requested deeper interrogation of the prisoner. Under careful questioning, the German pilot revealed more, though he clearly realized he had said too much and tried to become evasive. German bombers, particularly Heinkel He-111s, were being equipped with special radio receivers. These receivers picked up signals from ground transmitters called Nickebein, crooked leg, a name that referenced the bent shape of the directional antenna arrays. Pilots flying missions over England would tune their receivers and listen for a specific audio signal. When they heard steady dashes in their earphones, they were on the left side of the beam. When they heard dots, they were on the right side. But when the dots and dashes overlapped perfectly, creating a continuous tone, they were flying exactly along the center of the beam. All they had to do was follow that continuous tone until a second beam crossed the first, indicating they were over the target. Jones realized with growing horror that this system solved nearly every problem that had limited bombing accuracy. Weather didn't matter. Darkness didn't matter. Pilot navigation skills barely mattered. The radio beams were invisible guardrails that led German bombers precisely where German commanders wanted them to go. And if the British didn't find a way to interfere with these beams, if they didn't develop countermeasures immediately, German bombing campaigns would be devastatingly effective. Cities could be destroyed systematically. Factories could be targeted with precision. Military installations could be bombed regardless of weather or defensive measures. Britain would be pounded into submission. Jones immediately requested an emergency meeting with the highest levels of British military and political leadership. It was granted for June 21, 1940, a meeting that would later be remembered as one of the most important scientific briefings of the war. The location was the Cabinet War Rooms, the underground bunker complex beneath Whitehall, from which Churchill was directing Britain's war effort. The attendees were extraordinary. Churchill himself was present, along with Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, Sir Henry Tizard, the government's chief scientific advisor, Professor Lindemann, Churchill's personal science advisor, and various senior intelligence and military officers. Jones, at 28, was by far the youngest person in the room and the only one without military rank or political position. He was terrified. Churchill opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Dr. Jones, I'm told you have information about a German secret weapon that threatens our cities. I'm told that most of my military commanders think you're chasing phantoms. You have 30 minutes to convince me one way or the other." Jones took a deep breath and began. He described the Oslo report, the interrogation of the German prisoner, the fragmentary evidence that had been accumulating for months. Then he moved to the technical explanation, and this is where his background as a physicist became crucial. He could explain how radio beams worked in terms that non-scientists could understand. "Imagine," Jones said, addressing Churchill directly, "that you're trying to walk in a straight line across a pitch-dark field. You can't see anything, but someone is standing at the edge of the field with a torch, and they've covered the torch so it only creates a very narrow beam of light. If you walk through that beam, you know you're on the right path. If you drift left or right, you lose the light and know you've gone off course." German radio beams work on exactly the same principle, except instead of visible light, they use radio waves. And aircraft receivers can detect radio waves from hundreds of miles away, far beyond the range of any searchlight. The room was silent. Jones continued, warming to his subject. "The Germans have built powerful radio transmitters along the coast of occupied Europe. These transmitters use specially designed antennas that focus their signals into narrow beams, just a few degrees wide. The beams stretch across the English Channel and over Britain. A German bomber flies along one of these beams, guided by audio tones in the pilot's earphones. Where two beams cross, the pilot knows exactly where he is. That's where he drops his bombs. Air Marshal Sir Trafford Lee Mallory, a skeptic, interrupted. Dr. Jones, this is theoretically interesting, but practically impossible. Radio waves don't work the way you're describing. They spread out. They diffuse. You can't create a narrow beam over hundreds of miles. The curvature of the Earth alone would make this absurd. Jones had expected this objection. He pulled out diagrams and calculations he had prepared. With respect, sir, you're thinking of ordinary radio broadcasting. Those transmissions are intentionally omnidirectional to reach as wide an area as possible. But with careful antenna design, radio waves can be focused into very narrow beams. It's exactly analogous to how a flashlight reflector focuses light. The physics is well understood. I've done the calculations, accounting for the curvature of the Earth and atmospheric effects. It's not only possible, it's elegant. The Germans have found an ingenious solution to the navigation problem. Lindemann, Jones's former professor, spoke up. The technical aspects are sound. I've reviewed Dr. Jones's calculations. The real question is whether the Germans have actually implemented this in working systems. Dr. Jones, what evidence do we have beyond the prisoner's testimony? Jones laid out everything. The unusual radio equipment in crashed German bombers. The antenna installations photographed by reconnaissance aircraft along the French coast, installations with characteristics consistent with directional beam transmission. Intercepted German radio communications mentioning Nickebein and other terms associated with the system. Most tellingly, he showed them radio frequency logs from RAF monitoring stations that had detected unusual directional signals on specific frequencies. Signals that originated from the continent and passed over British territory. When you put all these pieces together, Jones argued, there's only one possible conclusion. The system exists, it's operational, and it's being used right now to guide German bombers to British targets. Churchill had been listening intently, occasionally puffing on his cigar. Now he leaned forward. Dr. Jones, assuming you're correct, and I'm inclined to believe you are, what can we do about these beams? Can we block them, jam them? Jones had thought carefully about this question. We have several options, sir. First, we need to confirm the exact frequencies and characteristics of the German beams. I recommend we immediately dispatch aircraft equipped with sensitive radio receivers to search for the beams, map their locations, and analyze their signals in detail. Once we understand precisely how the system works, we can develop countermeasures. Churchill turned to Dowding. Air Chief Marshal, can you provide Dr. Jones with the aircraft and equipment he needs? Dowding nodded. How soon do you need them? Jones answered immediately. Tonight, sir. Every night we delay, the Germans are using these beams to improve their bombing accuracy. We need to act now. Within hours, the decision was made. Jones would receive full support for what was secretly called the Battle of the Beams. He would have access to modified aircraft, radio equipment, technical specialists, and most importantly, authority to develop and deploy whatever countermeasures he deemed necessary. The race was on. Britain had finally acknowledged the threat. Now they had to find a way to neutralize it before German bombers could systematically destroy the country's ability to resist. That night, Jones barely slept. His mind raced through the technical challenges ahead. Finding the beams would be relatively straightforward now that they knew what to look for. Understanding their exact characteristics would take more work, but was certainly possible. The real challenge would be developing countermeasures that were effective without being obvious. If the British simply jammed the German beams with crude interference, the Germans would know their system had been compromised and would either switch to backup systems or modify their approach. Jones needed something more subtle. He needed to deceive the Germans, to make their own beams lie to them, to turn their technological advantage into a liability without them realizing what was happening. Over the next few days, Jones assembled a team of radio specialists, physicists, and engineers. Together they began what would become one of the most sophisticated electronic warfare campaigns in history. RAF aircraft equipped with sensitive radio receivers flew systematic search patterns over England, scanning the radio spectrum for the Connecabine signals. On the third night, they found one. An aircraft flying near Derby detected a narrow radio beam on a frequency of 30 megahertz, exactly as Jones had predicted. The beam originated from somewhere in occupied Europe and passed directly over the city. The pilot, following Jones's instructions, flew deliberately across the beam multiple times, mapping its width and characteristics. It was remarkably narrow, just a few degrees wide, and the audio tone changes were exactly as the captured German pilot had described. Steady dashes on one side, steady dots on the other, and a continuous tone exactly in the center. Jones was jubilant when he received the report. They had found the beams. More importantly, they now knew the exact frequencies, the signal characteristics, the beam widths. With this information, they could design precise countermeasures. Over the following week, more beams were located. The British discovered that the Germans had built at least 3 Connecabine transmitters along the European coast, each capable of covering different parts of England. By tracking where these beams intersected, Jones could predict which British cities and installations the Germans were preparing to attack. It was an intelligence windfall. But finding the beams was only the beginning. Now came the harder part, stopping them. Jones proposed a multi-layered approach to countering Connecabine. First, monitoring stations would track the beams continuously, providing early warning of when they were activated and where they were pointed. This would give British air defenses advance notice of likely targets. Second, and more importantly, the British would build their own radio transmitters to interfere with the German beams. But this interference would have to be subtle and sophisticated. Jones's plan was brilliant in its deviousness. Instead of simply jamming the German signals with overwhelming noise, which would immediately alert the Luftwaffe that their system had been compromised, British transmitters would send false signals on the same frequencies as the Connecabine beams. These false signals would be carefully crafted to sound authentic, but would be slightly different, enough to confuse German receivers without making it obvious that deliberate jamming was occurring. To a German pilot following what he thought was the Connecabine beam, the British false signals would make it seem like he was on course when he was actually slightly off, or that he had reached the intersection point when he was actually still miles away from the target. The German bombers would drop their bombs precisely where their equipment told them to, but that position would be wrong. And the beauty of it was that the Germans wouldn't immediately realize they were being deceived. They would think their equipment was malfunctioning or that atmospheric conditions were interfering with the beams. They might recalibrate their systems or blame their pilots, but they wouldn't immediately know that the British had discovered Connecabine and were actively countering it. The technical challenges of implementing this plan were formidable. British engineers had to build radio transmitters that could generate signals precisely matching the German beam characteristics. The frequency had to be exact. The modulation pattern that created the dots and dashes had to be perfect. The timing had to be synchronized with the genuine German beams so that the false signals blended with the real ones in ways that created confusion rather than obvious interference. Jones worked with teams at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, a secret facility where British scientists were developing cutting-edge radio and radar technology. Together, they designed transmitters specifically for beam warfare. These weren't general-purpose radio broadcasting systems. They were precision instruments designed for electronic deception. By late July 1940, the first British countermeasure transmitters were operational. They were given the code name Aspirin, a name chosen because they were meant to give the Germans a headache. The Aspirin stations were positioned at strategic locations across Britain, each one capable of transmitting false signals on the Connecabine frequencies. When German beams were detected, the Aspirin stations would activate, blending their false signals with the genuine beams. The first test came on the night of August 3, 1940. British monitors detected Connecabine beams being aligned over a munitions factory in the Midlands. As German bombers approached, the aspirin stations activated. The result exceeded Jones's hopes. The German bombers, following what they believed were reliable nicobine signals, dropped their bombs several miles from the intended target. An empty field was cratered with high explosives, while the munitions factory, the actual target, remained untouched. The Germans reported that the raid had been successful, confirming to Jones that they had no idea they'd been deceived. Over the following weeks, the same pattern repeated. German bombers would approach targets guided by nicobine beams. British aspirin stations would interfere subtly with the signals. Bombs would fall in the wrong locations, often in open countryside or in the sea. German bombing accuracy, which had been improving steadily as pilots gained experience with beam flying, suddenly plateaued and then began declining. Luftwaffe commanders were baffled. The nicobine system had worked brilliantly in testing and in early operations. Now it seemed unreliable. Pilots reported that the beams would sometimes drift, or that the crossing points didn't seem to align with the targets. Some German engineers suspected British interference, but they couldn't prove it. The signals seemed authentic. There was no obvious jamming. The most logical explanation seemed to be atmospheric disturbances or technical problems with the system itself. By September 1940, German confidence in nicobine had been seriously undermined. The system continued to be used, but Luftwaffe commanders no longer trusted it completely. Pilots were instructed to rely more on visual navigation when possible and to use nicobine only as a rough guide rather than a precision tool. Jones had achieved exactly what he intended. He had neutralized the German beam system without the Germans fully understanding what had happened. But he had no illusions that this victory was permanent. German engineers were among the best in the world. They would recognize that something was wrong with nicobine, and they would work on improvements or alternatives. The Battle of the Beams was far from over. Jones's suspicions were confirmed in early September when decoded German communications began referencing a new system, X-Gerät, the X device. Unlike nicobine, which seemed to be widely deployed across Luftwaffe bomber units, X-Gerät appeared to be limited to an elite unit, Kampfgruppe 100, KGR 100. This special bomber group was being trained on a new guidance system that German commanders clearly considered more sophisticated and more secret than nicobine. Jones immediately recognized the significance. The Germans were moving to their backup system, something they believed would be immune to whatever problems had afflicted nicobine. He urgently needed to understand how X-Gerät worked before it could be used operationally against British targets. The problem was that intelligence on X-Gerät was fragmentary. Intercepts mentioned it, but provided few technical details. No crashed aircraft carrying X-Gerät equipment had been recovered. Reconnaissance photographs showed nothing obviously different about KGR 100's bases. Jones had to piece together how the system worked from indirect clues and theoretical reasoning. He started by considering what limitations nicobine had, from a German perspective, that X-Gerät might address. Nicobine's weakness was that it relied on pilots correctly interpreting the audio tones and manually flying along the beam. There was room for human error. Also, determining the exact moment to drop bombs required pilots to judge when they had reached the intersection of two beams, a judgment that could be slightly imprecise. If Jones were designing an improved system, he would automate as much as possible. Remove human judgment from the equation. Make the system tell the pilot, or even tell the aircraft itself, exactly when to release weapons. Based on this reasoning, Jones developed a hypothesis. X-Gerät probably used multiple beams in sequence rather than just two intersecting beams. An aircraft would fly along a main beam, crossing several additional beams at precise intervals before reaching the target. These crossing beams could be used to automatically calculate the aircraft's speed and determine the exact release point for bombs. It would be elegant, precise, and much harder to spoof than nicobine because it involved complex timing calculations rather than simple beam following. To confirm this hypothesis, Jones needed more intelligence. He pushed for more aggressive interrogation of captured Luftwaffe personnel, more intensive monitoring of German radio communications, more frequent reconnaissance flights over known KGR-100 installations. Slowly, fragmentary clues accumulated. A prisoner mentioned training on a complicated new system with multiple tones. An intercepted communication referenced 5 beam transmitters, more than Nicobine used. A reconnaissance photograph showed antenna installations at a German base with unusual configurations. By late September, Jones was confident he understood the basic principles of X-Juret. The system used one main guidance beam, like Nicobine, that the bomber would follow toward the target. But then, it used 3 additional crossbeams positioned at precise distances before the target. The first crossbeam, about 30 kilometers from the target, would alert the crew to prepare. The second crossbeam, about 20 kilometers out, would start an automatic clock in the aircraft. The third crossbeam, about 5 kilometers from target, would stop the clock. The system would calculate the aircraft's speed based on how long it took to fly between those 2 beams, then automatically release bombs at exactly the right moment to hit the target. No pilot judgment required, no possibility of human error, just mathematics and automation. The elegance of the system was terrifying. If Jones's hypothesis was correct, X-Juret would be far more accurate than Nicobine and much harder to counter. You couldn't simply confuse the pilot with false signals because the pilot wasn't making the critical decisions. You would have to interfere with the entire sequence of beams in a coordinated way, making the timing calculations come out wrong without making it obvious that you were doing so. Jones presented his findings to a meeting of senior air defense commanders in early October. He laid out his understanding of X-Juret and proposed countermeasures. The key, he explained, is to recognize that X-Juret depends on precise timing. If we can interfere with any of the crossbeams, making them appear slightly earlier or later than they actually are, the automatic calculations will be wrong. The bombs will drop too soon or too late. But we need to know the exact frequencies and locations of the X-Juret transmitters before we can build appropriate countermeasures. One of the commanders asked the question everyone was thinking. How much time do we have before they use this system against us? Jones's answer was sobering. Based on the intelligence we have, KGR-100 is fully trained and operational. They could launch X-Juret guided raids at any time. We need to locate these transmitters immediately, within days if possible, or we'll be facing precision bombing raids that we can't stop. The urgency galvanized resources. More reconnaissance aircraft were assigned to photograph suspected transmitter sites along the French coast. Radio monitoring stations were equipped with better receivers to detect new frequencies. A special intelligence cell was set up to coordinate all information related to X-Juret. The breakthrough came on October 15, 1940. An RAF reconnaissance aircraft photographed a site near WWII, Cherbourg, that showed a unique antenna configuration, a large central mast surrounded by several smaller reflector elements. Jones, studying the photographs with a magnifying glass, felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The antenna configuration exactly matched what would be needed to generate the precise directional beams that X-Juret required. He immediately ordered intensive radio monitoring focused on that location. Within 24 hours, monitors had detected transmissions on new frequencies, around 66 to 75 megahertz, coming from the Cherbourg area. These signals had characteristics different from Nicobine, but consistent with Jones's predictions for X-Juret. Over the following week, 2 more X-Juret transmitter sites were located, one near Calais and another near Brest. By triangulating the beams from these transmitters, Jones could determine where they intersected, revealing which British targets the Germans were preparing to attack. The situation was dire. The Germans had set up X-Juret beams focusing on several critical targets, including aircraft factories, shipyards, and industrial centers. KGR-100 was clearly preparing for a systematic campaign of precision bombing, and the British countermeasures designed for Nicobine wouldn't work against X-Juret. They needed new systems, new transmitters tuned to different frequencies, new jamming strategies appropriate for the multi-beam timing approach. Jones and his team worked frantically. They designed new countermeasure transmitters, codenamed Bromide, specifically to interfere with X-Juret. The technical challenge was that they couldn't simply jam the beams directly. That would be too obvious. Instead, they needed to transmit false beams on the same frequencies, positioned to interfere with the timing calculations in subtle ways. The principle was similar to what they'd done with Konikabene, but more complex. A bromide transmitter would detect when a genuine X-Juret beam was active, then transmit its own signal on the same frequency, slightly delayed or advanced. To the automatic equipment in a German bomber, this would make it seem like the crossbeams were in slightly different positions than they actually were. The timing calculations would use these false positions, resulting in bombs being released too early or too late. Engineers at TRE worked around the clock building the bromide transmitters. But there was a problem. They needed several weeks to build enough units to provide comprehensive coverage of likely targets. And from the intelligence Jones was seeing, KGR-100 was preparing to launch operations within days, not weeks. Britain was about to face precision bombing raids using guidance technology that couldn't yet be fully countered. On the evening of November 8, 1940, Jones received confirmation of what he had feared. Decoded intercepts indicated that KGR-100 was planning a major operation for mid-November. The target was not yet clear, but the scale was unprecedented. This would be a massive raid using the full capabilities of X-Juret, intended to demonstrate to both German High Command and British defenders what precision bombing could achieve. Jones met with Churchill to brief him on the situation. The Prime Minister listened gravely as Jones explained the threat. "We have partial countermeasures in place," Jones said, "but not enough to fully protect all possible targets. KGR-100 will achieve better bombing accuracy than we've seen before. There will be significant damage and casualties." Churchill asked the hard question. "Can we determine the specific target in advance? If we know where they're going, we can concentrate our defenses, evacuate civilians if necessary." Jones answered carefully. "We're monitoring the alignment of the X-Juret beams. Once they're precisely set for the target, we'll be able to identify it. But that might not happen until shortly before the raid. We might have only hours of warning, perhaps less." Churchill nodded slowly, his expression grim. "Very well. Continue your work, Dr. Jones. Give us whatever warning you can. We'll prepare as best we're able." Over the following days, Jones's monitoring teams tracked the X-Juret beams obsessively. They watched as the beams were adjusted and calibrated, slowly narrowing down the possible target locations. By November 12th, the beams were clearly focusing on the Midlands region of England. By November 13th, Jones was certain. The target was Coventry. The monitoring data was unambiguous. The X-Juret beams intersected precisely over the center of Coventry, an industrial city with crucial aircraft factories, munitions plants, and engineering works. The scheduled date, based on decoded communications referencing moon phases and weather forecasts, was November 14th. The code name was Moonlight Sonata. Jones immediately informed military commanders and Churchill. This created an agonizing situation. British leadership now had advanced knowledge of a massive air raid on a specific target. They could take various actions. They could order mass evacuation of Coventry, though this would certainly alert the Germans that their plans had been compromised. They could concentrate every available fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft gun around Coventry, though, again, this unusual buildup might signal that the British had specific intelligence. They could deploy maximum electronic countermeasures, jamming the X-Juret beams as aggressively as possible, which would reveal to the Germans that their sophisticated system had been compromised. Or they could do what intelligence logic suggested, deploy partial countermeasures that would reduce the raid's effectiveness without revealing the full extent of British knowledge, warn local authorities to prepare for a possible raid without specifying how certain that knowledge was, and accept that people would die in order to protect the larger secret that Britain had broken Germany's beam guidance systems. The decision made in meetings at the highest level of government was a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed necessary from a cold intelligence calculus. Coventry authorities were warned to prepare for a possible major raid. Additional firefighting equipment was positioned. Some limited civil defense measures were put in place. But there was no mass evacuation, no unusual concentration of fighters, no obvious indication that the British knew exactly what was coming. The bromide countermeasure transmitters that were available would be deployed, but not so aggressively that the Germans would immediately realize their beams had been compromised. It was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. They were choosing to let the raid proceed with only partial countermeasures, knowing that people would die in order to protect the larger intelligence asset and avoid revealing how much the British knew. Jones understood the logic. If the Germans realized that Decoded had been completely broken, they would switch to other systems or modify their approach in ways that might take months to understand and counter. In the meantime, more raids would occur, potentially causing even more casualties. Sacrificing some protection for Coventry might save more lives overall. But understanding the logic didn't make it feel any less like he was personally condemning people to death. On the afternoon of November 14th, Jones sat in his office watching the clock. He had done everything within his power. The bromide transmitters were positioned and ready. Monitoring stations were tracking the German beams. Coventry's defenses were on alert, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. That evening, at 7:10 p.m., German Pathfinder aircraft began crossing the English coast. They were aircraft from KGR 100, the elite unit equipped with Decoded. Their job was to locate the target using the precision guidance system and mark it with incendiary bombs for the main bomber force that would follow. Jones listened to reports coming in from the monitoring stations. The Decoded beams are active. The bombers are following them. They're approaching Coventry. Our bromide transmitters are interfering with the beams, but the aircraft are still getting through. At 7:20 p.m., the first bombs fell on Coventry. The Pathfinders, guided by Decoded despite British interference, dropped clusters of incendiary bombs that started fires across the city center. These fires would serve as beacons for the hundreds of bombers that were now approaching. Aircraft that would spend the next 11 hours systematically destroying Coventry. Jones remained in his office throughout the night, receiving updates every few minutes. The reports were devastating. The city center was ablaze. The 14th-century cathedral was destroyed. Residential areas were being pounded with high explosive bombs. Casualties were mounting. The only small mercy was that the bromide transmitters were having some effect. Analysis of bomb impacts showed that many explosives were falling outside the central city, in suburban areas and open fields where they caused less damage. Without any countermeasures at all, the destruction would have been even worse, concentrated entirely in the densely populated industrial center. But this was cold comfort. By dawn on November 15th, the raid was over. Coventry had been devastated. Hundreds of people were dead. Thousands were injured. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. The medieval city center, which had stood for centuries, was gone. The images that emerged in the following days were apocalyptic. Streets filled with rubble, buildings reduced to skeletal walls, and survivors wandering in shock through the ruins of their city. Jones felt physically sick when he saw the photographs. He had known this was coming. He had deployed the countermeasures available to him, but it felt like failure. 2 days after the raid, Jones traveled to Coventry with a team of technical specialists to analyze the bombing patterns. They needed to understand exactly how effective the Decoded system had been and how much their bromide countermeasures had helped. The analysis would inform decisions about how to improve defenses against future raids. Walking through the destroyed city was one of the most difficult experiences of Jones's life. The scale of destruction was overwhelming. But what affected him most deeply were the ordinary moments. A child's toy lying in the rubble of a destroyed home. An elderly man carefully salvaging books from what had been his library. A woman hanging laundry in the yard of a house that no longer had a roof. At one point, Jones and his team were surveying a bomb crater, taking measurements and photographs, when an elderly woman approached them. She was covered in dust, and her clothes were torn, but she carried herself with dignity. "What are you doing?" she asked, gesturing at their equipment and clipboards. Jones struggled to find words. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he was analyzing the effectiveness of secret radio guidance systems and electronic countermeasures, that he had known this raid was coming, that he and others had made decisions about how much to interfere with enemy systems versus how much to protect the larger intelligence secret. Instead, he said simply, "We're trying to understand what happened so we can stop it from happening again." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My daughter lived there," pointing to a collapsed building down the street. "She was home with her baby when the bombs fell. They didn't make it out." Jones couldn't speak. The woman continued, "So you make sure this doesn't happen again. You make sure my daughter and grandson didn't die for nothing. You make sure you stop the bastards who did this." Jones managed to say, "I promise you, we're doing everything we can." The woman nodded, then walked away, moving with the careful steps of someone who was holding herself together through sheer will. Jones stood frozen for several minutes after she left. His colleagues waited silently, understanding that something important had just happened. Finally, Jones said quietly, "We need to make our countermeasures more effective. We need to stop these raids completely, not just reduce their accuracy. Let's finish this analysis and get back to work." The technical analysis of the Coventry raid confirmed what Jones had suspected. The X-Juret system had worked largely as designed, guiding KGR-100 pathfinders to their target with precision despite British interference. However, the bromide transmitters had introduced enough uncertainty into the beam signals that many bombs, perhaps 20 to 30%, had fallen outside the intended target area. It wasn't enough, but it proved that the countermeasures concept worked. They just needed to be stronger, more sophisticated, more comprehensive. Over the following weeks, production of bromide transmitters was accelerated. More units were built and positioned to cover all major British cities and industrial areas. Jones and his team also refined their jamming techniques, learning to more effectively interfere with the X-Juret timing sequences without making the interference obvious. By December 1940, British electronic countermeasures had significantly improved. When KGR-100 attempted raids using X-Juret guidance, they increasingly found their bombs falling wide of intended targets. German Bomber Command began reporting that X-Juret was becoming unreliable. Pilots complained that the system gave inconsistent results. Engineers checked and rechecked the transmitters and couldn't find obvious problems. The Germans suspected British interference, but couldn't prove it, and didn't understand the sophisticated nature of what the British were doing. By early 1941, German confidence in X-Juret had been undermined. The system continued to be used, but it was no longer the precision weapon that German planners had envisioned. More importantly for Jones and British intelligence, the Germans began developing yet another beam system, one they hoped would be immune to whatever was affecting Nicobane and X-Juret. This new system would prove to be the most sophisticated yet, and countering it would require Jones to push the boundaries of electronic warfare even further. But before we explore that next phase of the Invisible War, we need to understand the broader context of what Jones had achieved. By the end of 1940, German night bombing campaigns against Britain, the Blitz, were causing significant damage and casualties. But they were far less effective than they should have been. German bombers were missing their targets by miles instead of yards. Bombs that were supposed to destroy factories were falling in fields. Raids that were planned as knockout blows were instead becoming expensive failures that achieved little strategic effect while costing the Luftwaffe aircraft and crews. The Battle of the Beams. Jones's Invisible War was a major reason why the Blitz failed to break Britain's will to resist. If German bombers had been able to attack with the precision that Nicobane and X-Juret should have provided, if every raid had been as devastating as Coventry, Britain's industrial capacity would have been crippled. Aircraft production would have plummeted. Shipbuilding would have been disrupted. The naval ports that were critical for supply convoys would have been destroyed. Britain might have been forced to negotiate peace from a position of weakness. Instead, British factories continued producing aircraft. Ports remained operational. The civilian population, though suffering terrible hardship, maintained morale. And the RAF Fighter Command, which had barely survived the Battle of Britain in summer 1940, was able to rebuild its strength. Jones's work was a crucial part of why Britain survived this critical period. His was not the kind of heroism that made headlines. There were no dramatic aerial dogfights, no brave charges against enemy positions. Just a young scientist working 18-hour days in a cramped office, analyzing radio signals and designing transmitters, solving problems that most people couldn't even understand. But the impact was enormous. Every bomb that fell in an empty field instead of on a factory, every raid that failed to achieve its objectives, every German pilot who grew frustrated with unreliable guidance systems, these were victories in the invisible war that Jones was winning. And the Germans, despite their excellent scientists and engineers, never fully understood what was happening. They knew something was interfering with their systems. They suspected British jamming. But they didn't realize the sophistication of Jones's approach, the way he was turning their own technology against them, using their radio beams to mislead rather than simply blocking them. By spring 1941, the strategic situation was changing. Germany was preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This massive undertaking required transferring substantial Luftwaffe resources to the Eastern Front. The intensity of bombing, campaigns against Britain, decreased as German air power was redirected eastward. But even as the immediate pressure on Britain lessened, Jones knew that the invisible war wasn't over. German research and development continued. New systems were in the pipeline, and Jones's monitoring networks were picking up references to something called Wotan, a single-eyed god in Norse mythology. The mythological reference suggested a new guidance system, and the name implied a single beam rather than the multiple beams used by Nicobine and X-Gerät. Jones was intrigued and concerned. A single beam system would have advantages and disadvantages compared to earlier approaches. It would be simpler, potentially more reliable. But how could it provide the precision that X-Gerät had achieved with its complex multi-beam timing arrangement? Jones began theoretical analysis of what a single-beam precision guidance system might look like. He considered various approaches, ways to encode range information in a single beam, methods for calculating distance from the transmitter, techniques for telling an aircraft exactly when it had reached the right position to release bombs. One possibility stood out as particularly elegant: a transponder system. The ground transmitter would interrogate the aircraft with a radio pulse. The aircraft would respond. By measuring the time delay between sending the pulse and receiving the response, the ground station could calculate the aircraft's distance with great precision. This range information could then be transmitted back to the aircraft, giving it continuous updates on exactly how far it was from the target. Combined with beam guidance to control the aircraft's direction, this would provide full three-dimensional positioning, azimuth from the beam and range from the transponder. The aircraft would know precisely where it was at all times. Jones realized that if the Germans had developed such a system, it would be extraordinarily difficult to counter in the ways that had worked against Nicobine and X-Gerät. You couldn't just transmit false beams because the ranging system would reveal the deception. The aircraft would know its true distance from the transmitter regardless of what the beam seemed to indicate. Jamming the transponder signals would be obvious and would immediately alert the Germans that their system was compromised. Jones needed a different approach. If you can't jam or deceive the system directly, he reasoned, then you have to become part of the system. What if British transmitters could respond to the German interrogation pulses, pretending to be the aircraft's transponder? The ground station would receive two responses, one genuine from the actual aircraft and one false from British transmitters. If the false response was timed correctly, It could confuse the ranging calculations, making the Germans think the aircraft was in a different position than it actually was. The concept was theoretically sound, but technically challenging. British transmitters would have to detect the German interrogation pulses, which were likely very brief and on unusual frequencies, generate false responses that were indistinguishable from genuine aircraft transponder signals, time those responses precisely to create the right kind of confusion in the German ranging calculations, all while remaining undetected as artificial signals. It was electronic warfare at a level of sophistication that had never been attempted. But Jones believed it was possible. In May 1941, Jones's predictions were confirmed. Intelligence reports indicated that a new guidance system, designated WWII or WOTAN, was being tested. The system used exactly the approach Jones had theorized. A single beam for directional guidance combined with a ranging transponder that provided precise distance information. Aircraft equipped with WWII could be guided to their targets with extraordinary accuracy using just one ground station. The implications were serious. WWII was in some ways superior to the earlier systems. It required less infrastructure, just one transmitter rather than multiple beam stations. It was harder to interfere with using the techniques that had worked against Nikobane and Exjuret, and it provided continuous position information rather than just guidance along preset paths. If WWII became widely deployed, German bombing accuracy would improve dramatically, despite all the countermeasures Jones had implemented against earlier systems. Jones presented the problem to his team at a meeting in late May. He explained how the system worked, outlined why conventional jamming wouldn't be effective, and described his proposed solution: masking beacons that would respond to German interrogation pulses with false information. The technical challenges were daunting. Dr. Robert Cockburn, one of Britain's leading electronic warfare specialists, spoke up after Jones finished his briefing. In principle, what you're proposing should work. We become a false transponder, feeding incorrect range data to the German ground stations. But the timing has to be incredibly precise. We're talking about radio pulses that last microseconds. The German system will be using those tiny time differences to calculate distances. If our false responses aren't timed exactly right, the Germans will see them as obviously fake. Jones nodded. That's correct. This is going to require building equipment that's more precise than anything we've done before. We need to detect pulses that might be on any of several frequencies, analyze them in real time to understand their characteristics, generate false responses that are identical in every way except timing, and transmit those responses with microsecond precision. It's at the absolute edge of what's technically possible, but we don't have a choice. If we can't counter WWII, we're back to where we were before we discovered Nikobane, facing precision bombing that we can't prevent. The team went to work. Over the following months, they developed what they called masking beacons, sophisticated electronic systems designed specifically to counter WWII. The engineering was extraordinarily complex. The masking beacons used some of the most advanced radio technology available at the time, including elements that would later be recognized as early forms of radar jamming and electronic deception. By late summer 1941, prototype masking beacons were ready for testing. The challenge was that they couldn't be tested against real WWII systems without alerting the Germans. Instead, Jones's team built their own simulators, recreating the German system based on intelligence about its characteristics, and tested their masking beacons against these simulators. The results were promising. The masking beacons could successfully intercept interrogation pulses and generate convincing false responses. When timed correctly, these false responses would make the ranging calculations give incorrect results, indicating that an aircraft was closer to or further from the target than it actually was. Production of masking beacons began in September 1941. The first operational units were deployed in October, positioned around likely German targets in Britain. And just in time. Intelligence indicated that WWII was about to become operational. Kampfgruppe 100, the elite unit that had used Exjuret during the Coventry raid, was being re-equipped with the new system. The first WWII guided raid occurred on the night of October 8, 1941. The target was a naval facility on the south coast. German bombers approached, guided by the single Wotan beam and receiving continuous range information from their transponders. But the British masking beacons were active, detecting the German interrogation pulses and responding with carefully timed false signals. The result was exactly what Jones had hoped for. The German ranging system, receiving both genuine responses from aircraft transponders and false responses from British masking beacons, produced confused position calculations. The bombers, trusting their equipment, dropped bombs at what they believed was the correct position, but they were actually several miles off target. The naval facility was barely touched. Most bombs fell into the sea or in fields. In the days following the raid, German technical personnel checked and rechecked their WWII equipment. Everything seemed to be functioning correctly. The interrogation pulses were being sent. Responses were being received. But the position calculations seemed unreliable. They attributed this to possible atmospheric interference or technical glitches in the still new system. Over the following weeks, more WWII raids were attempted. All of them were affected by British masking beacons. German bombing accuracy, which should have been excellent with the new guidance system, was poor. Bombs consistently fell wide of intended targets. KGR-100 pilots began losing confidence in WWII, just as they had previously lost confidence in XWII. By early 1942, German Bomber Command had to face an uncomfortable reality. None of their sophisticated radio guidance systems were working reliably. Knickebeen had become unreliable in 1940. XWII had become unreliable in early 1941. Now WWII, the most advanced system yet, was also proving undependable. Some German officers suspected British electronic warfare, but the evidence was unclear. The British weren't using crude jamming that would be easy to detect. Instead, they were doing something far more sophisticated. Something that made German systems seem to malfunction rather than seem to be jammed. And German engineers, despite their considerable expertise, couldn't figure out exactly what the British were doing. The Battle of the Beams had reached a stalemate. German research continued on guidance systems, but confidence was shaken. The Luftwaffe increasingly relied on traditional navigation methods, visual identification of targets when possible, dead reckoning, and celestial navigation when not. The era of precision night bombing guided by radio beams had effectively ended before it really began, defeated by Jones and his team of scientists and engineers. The impact on the course of the war was significant. Germany's strategic bombing campaign against Britain, which should have been devastatingly effective with the guidance systems they'd developed, had instead been largely neutralized. British industrial production continued. Cities, though damaged, remained functional. The RAF retained its ability to defend Britain and increasingly to launch its own bombing campaigns against German targets. Britain survived the critical period when it stood alone against Nazi Germany, survived long enough for the United States to enter the war, survived long enough to become the base from which the eventual liberation of Europe would be launched. And a significant factor in that survival was the invisible war that Jones had fought and won. But Jones's war wasn't over. As the Battle of the Beams wound down, his attention was drawn to intelligence reports about other German secret weapons programs. Reports that would lead him to uncover threats potentially far more dangerous than radio-guided bombers. In June 1942, Jones received a report from British intelligence officers interrogating German prisoners of war. One prisoner, a Luftwaffe officer, had made an unusual comment during interrogation. He had said something about revenge weapons that Germany was developing, weapons that would change the course of the war. The interrogators hadn't pressed for details, but the comment was included in their report. Jones was intrigued. Revenge weapons could mean many things: new aircraft designs, improved bombs, chemical or biological weapons. But the term had an ominous quality. It suggested something beyond incremental improvements to existing technology. Jones began collecting any intelligence that might relate to new German weapons programs. Over the summer of 1942, fragmentary reports accumulated. A resistance source in Poland mentioned seeing strange rocket-like objects at a German testing facility. A photo reconnaissance flight over the Baltic coast captured images of unusual installations at a place called Peenemünde. A decrypted German message referenced long-range bombardment systems. None of this was conclusive, but Jones's instincts, honed by his work on the beam systems, told him there was something important here. He requested more surveillance of Peenemünde. In late 1942 and early 1943, reconnaissance aircraft made several flights over the area, bringing back photographs that Jones and his team analyzed with great care. What they saw was puzzling and alarming. Large rockets on test stands, much bigger than any aircraft bomb or battlefield rocket. Unusual circular structures that might be launch platforms. Extensive research facilities with laboratories, workshops, and what appeared to be advanced engineering equipment. Underground facilities being constructed, possibly for production or storage. Jones realized he was looking at evidence of a major German rocket program. This was something qualitatively different from everything he had worked on before. Radio-guided bombers were impressive technology, but they were still bombers, aircraft that flew at limited speeds and could be shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft guns. Rockets were different. If Germany had developed long-range rocket weapons, they could strike targets without any way to intercept them. There would be no warning, no air raid sirens giving people time to take shelter. A rocket launched from Europe could hit London before anyone knew it was coming. Jones prepared a briefing for military and political leadership outlining what he believed was happening at Peenemünde. He presented the photographic evidence, the intelligence reports, and his analysis suggesting that Germany was developing operational rocket weapons capable of carrying significant explosive payloads across hundreds of miles. The reaction was mixed. Some officials were skeptical. Rockets seemed like science fiction, the kind of thing from H.G. Wells novels rather than practical weapons. Others were alarmed but uncertain what to do about it. How do you defend against weapons that move too fast to intercept and give no warning before they strike? Jones argued forcefully for action. We need to disrupt this program before these weapons become operational. The most effective approach would be to bomb Peenemünde, destroy their research facilities, kill their scientists and engineers, set back their development timeline by months or years. Churchill was convinced. In June 1943, he authorized Operation Hydra, a massive bombing raid on Peenemünde. Planning for the raid was meticulous. Peenemünde was beyond the range of fighter escorts, so the bombers would be vulnerable to German night fighters. The target was small and required precise navigation. The raid would have to be at night to minimize bomber losses, but night bombing reduced accuracy. To maximize the chances of success, the RAF deployed nearly every resource at its disposal. Over 600 bombers from Bomber Command, the most sophisticated navigation aids available including early radar-based systems that Jones had helped develop, elaborate deception operations to confuse German defenses about the real target. The raid took place on the night of August 17-18, 1943. It was one of the most important air operations of the war, though few people recognized that at the time. The British public and even most military personnel didn't know what Peenemünde was or why it mattered. The bombing was partially successful. Significant damage was done to workshops, laboratories, and housing for scientists and engineers. Several key personnel were killed, including Dr. Walter Thiel, a leading rocket propulsion expert. Construction of underground facilities was disrupted, but the cost was high. 40 British bombers were shot down by German night fighters. Over 300 aircrew were killed or captured. German production facilities, many of which were dispersed and hidden, were not completely destroyed. The rocket program was set back, but not eliminated. In the months following the raid, Jones continued monitoring intelligence for signs of German rocket activity. What he learned was sobering. The Germans were indeed developing advanced rocket weapons. Two types specifically: a cruise missile designated Vergeltungswaffe 1, Revenge Weapon 1, or V1, and a ballistic missile designated V-2. The V-1 was essentially a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine. It was relatively slow, flying at about 400 miles per hour, but carried a large warhead and could be launched in large numbers. Most importantly for defense planning, it could potentially be shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft guns because it flew at altitudes and speeds that conventional weapons could engage. The V-2 was far more dangerous. A true ballistic missile, it would reach altitudes of over 50 miles and speeds of over 3,000 miles per hour during its descent. There was no way to shoot it down with existing technology. Once launched, it would hit its target with certainty. The only defense would be to destroy the missiles before they could be launched, or to attack the launching sites. Jones worked with military planners to develop responses to both threats. For V-1s, a combination of fighter patrols, anti-aircraft guns, and barrage balloons could provide some defense. For V-2s, the only real option was intelligence-driven preemptive strikes against launch sites and supply facilities. The V-weapons began falling on Britain in summer 1944. The first V-1 landed on June 13, 1944, a week after D-Day. Over the following months, thousands of V-1s were launched at London and other targets. The psychological impact was significant. Unlike conventional bombing raids, V-1s could arrive at any time of day or night, with little warning. The distinctive sound of their pulse jet engines became terrifying to civilians, particularly because the engine would cut out just before the missile dove to impact, creating a few seconds of awful silence before the explosion. British defenses adapted quickly. Fighter pilots learned to intercept V-1s, either shooting them down or, in a dangerous maneuver, using their wing to tip the V-1 off course. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned to create defensive zones through which V-1s had to pass. By late summer 1944, over 75% of V-1s were being destroyed before reaching their targets. The V-2 was a different matter. The first V-2 landed on September 8, 1944 in London. There was no warning. The missile struck at over 2,000 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound, so the explosion was heard before the sound of the missile's approach. There was no defense. For the British public, this was terrifying in a new way. At least with V-1s, you could hear them coming and had some chance to take shelter. With V-2s, there was nothing. One moment you were going about your business, the next moment, a building disappeared in an explosion. Over 1,000 V-2s hit Britain before the war ended. Each carried a 1-ton warhead. The casualties were significant, over 2,700 killed, over 6,000 seriously injured. But the strategic impact was limited. The V-2 program consumed enormous German resources that might have been used to build conventional weapons or defenses. The missiles were expensive and complex to build, required rare materials and highly skilled labor, needed elaborate launch facilities and supply chains. For all that investment, the Germans got a weapon that could deliver 1 ton of explosives per missile, far less destructive than a conventional bombing raid using multiple aircraft. Jones later reflected that the V-2, despite being a technological marvel, was actually a strategic failure for Germany. If they had invested those resources in building more conventional aircraft, tanks, or submarines, they would have gotten better military value. The rocket program was impressive science and engineering, but poor strategy. However, Jones also recognized the long-term significance of what Germany had achieved. The V-2 was the world's first operational ballistic missile, the ancestor of every space rocket and military missile developed since. After the war, both the United States and Soviet Union scrambled to capture German rocket scientists and technology. The space race of the 1960s, the ICBM arsenals of the Cold War, all of it traced back to the work done at Peenemünde. And Jones's intelligence work, leading to the bombing of Peenemünde in 1943, had disrupted that program at a critical moment. The raid didn't stop German rocket development, but it delayed it by months and forced dispersal of facilities that made production more difficult. If Peenemünde had been left untouched, V-weapons might have been ready earlier, potentially affecting the outcome of the D-Day landings and the subsequent liberation of Europe. But there was an even more significant secret at Peenemünde that Jones didn't learn about until after the war ended. Some of the scientists working there were not just developing rockets, they were involved in Germany's nuclear weapons research program. The facilities at Peenemünde had connections to other sites where German physicists were working on uranium enrichment and reactor designs. The rocket program and the nuclear program were not entirely separate. German planners envisioned that if their physicists successfully developed atomic bombs, V-2 rockets might be adapted to deliver them. Imagine the strategic implications. Nuclear-armed ballistic missiles in 1944 or 1945. London, Moscow, even American cities on the East Coast might have been within range if longer-range versions had been developed. The war could have ended very differently. When Jones learned after the war about these connections, when he saw captured German documents describing the linkages between rocket research and nuclear weapons programs, he felt a chill. His intelligence work on the beam systems had led him to investigate Peenemünde, which led to the bombing raid that disrupted rocket development, which inadvertently also disrupted nuclear weapons research. If he hadn't followed the trail from radio beams to rockets, if the Peenemünde raid hadn't happened, if German nuclear research had proceeded unimpeded, the outcome was almost too terrible to contemplate. This was the ultimate validation of Jones's approach to intelligence work. By following the evidence wherever it led, by taking seriously even fragmentary clues, by pushing for action based on scientific analysis even when others were skeptical, he had helped prevent not just the immediate threat of precision bombing, but potentially the catastrophic threat of nuclear-armed Germany. Jones would never claim sole credit for these achievements. The bombing of Peenemünde involved thousands of people, from the aircrew who flew the mission to the planners who organized it to the intelligence analysts who identified the target. The Battle of the Beams was won by teams of engineers and scientists and operators, not by one person. But Jones had been the crucial figure, the one who understood the technical details, who made the conceptual leaps, who convinced skeptical commanders to take action, who designed the countermeasures, and who saw the connections that others missed. As the war moved toward its conclusion in 1945, Jones's role shifted. The immediate threats that had consumed his attention for 5 years were being eliminated as Allied forces advanced into Germany. But the knowledge gained during the war about electronic warfare, about scientific intelligence, about the interplay between technology and strategy, all of this needed to be preserved and passed on. Jones began documenting everything his team had learned. He wanted future scientists and intelligence officers to understand not just what had been done, but how and why. The technical details of the German beam systems and British countermeasures were recorded in meticulous reports. The methodologies for scientific intelligence analysis were written up as guides for future analysts. The lessons learned about the importance of integrating scientific expertise into intelligence work were compiled for military planners. Some of this documentation remained classified for decades. The techniques Jones had pioneered for electronic warfare were too valuable to reveal publicly while the Cold War was developing. But within military and intelligence circles, Jones's work became legendary. He had essentially created the field of scientific and technical intelligence as a distinct discipline. Before Jones, intelligence agencies had scientists as consultants, people who could be brought in occasionally to answer specific technical questions. After Jones, it became clear that scientists needed to be integral parts of the intelligence process, continuously engaged, able to direct collection efforts, empowered to make recommendations on policy and operations. Every major intelligence agency in the world eventually adopted this model. In Britain, this led to the creation of dedicated scientific intelligence branches within MI6 and other services. In the United States, the CIA and military intelligence agencies developed technical collection and analysis capabilities that drew heavily on Jones's methodologies. The Cold War competition in missiles, nuclear weapons, radar, and eventually satellites and computers was fought partially through scientific intelligence operations that Jones had pioneered. When the war ended in May 1945, Jones was just 33 years old. He had spent 6 years in intelligence work that had aged him in ways that weren't visible but were deeply felt. The decisions he had participated in, the knowledge of raids and casualties, the weight of secrets that couldn't be shared, all of it had marked him. He returned to academic life, taking a position at Aberdeen University, where he became a professor of natural philosophy, the old Scottish term for physics. For many years, Jones couldn't speak publicly about his war work. The Official Secrets Act bound him to silence. His students and colleagues knew he had done something important during the war, but not what. Jones devoted himself to teaching and research, training a new generation of physicists. Many of his students went on to careers in defense research and development, carrying forward his legacy in ways they didn't fully understand, because Jones couldn't tell them about his wartime achievements. Gradually, as years passed and Cold War tensions allowed some secrets to be revealed, the story of Jones's work began to emerge. In the 1970s, restrictions were loosened enough that Jones could write about some of his wartime experiences. His autobiography, Most Secret War, published in 1978, revealed for the first time the full story of the Battle of the Beams and his other intelligence work. The book was a sensation. Here was an adventure story as exciting as any spy thriller, except it was true. A young scientist taking on Nazi Germany's most advanced weapons, winning through brilliance and determination, saving countless lives through work that had remained unknown for decades. Jones became something of a celebrity in his later years. He was sought after for interviews and lectures. He received numerous honors, including a knighthood, becoming Sir Reginald Victor Jones. Military and intelligence organizations around the world invited him to speak about his experiences and the lessons they contained. What Jones emphasized in his lectures and writings was not his individual brilliance, though that was certainly part of the story. What he wanted people to understand was the importance of the scientific method in intelligence work, the need to form hypotheses and test them against evidence, the willingness to question assumptions and revise conclusions when new data emerged, the importance of understanding not just what enemies were doing, but why they were making the technical choices they made. He also emphasized the human dimension. Intelligence work, Jones argued, was ultimately about people, understanding what scientists and engineers on the other side were trying to achieve, recognizing that they were smart and capable, not dismissing their achievements, predicting their next moves based on understanding their constraints and objectives. And on the British side, motivating teams to do their best work under desperate conditions, making difficult decisions that balanced immediate needs against longer-term considerations, living with the consequences of those decisions. Jones spoke often about Coventry, about the terrible choice to allow the raid to proceed with only partial countermeasures in order to protect larger secrets. He never claimed that choice was right in any simple moral sense, but he argued it was necessary, that intelligence work in wartime forced such choices, that the only truly immoral option would have been to pretend such dilemmas didn't exist. He remained haunted by the elderly woman he had met in the ruins of Coventry, the woman who had lost her daughter and grandson, who had told him to make sure it didn't happen again. That encounter, Jones said, reminded him constantly that the technical work he did, the frequencies and calculations and countermeasures, all of it translated into human lives. The equations were not abstract. Every successful countermeasure meant someone who didn't die, whose home wasn't destroyed, whose family stayed intact. Jones believed that scientists who worked on defense and intelligence matters needed to maintain that connection to human consequences. It was too easy to become absorbed in the technical challenges, to think of it all as an intellectual game. Remembering that real people's lives depended on your work, that was essential for maintaining moral perspective. In his final years, Jones reflected on the broader legacy of his work. The Battle of the Beams had introduced concepts that became fundamental to modern warfare. Electronic warfare, The use of electromagnetic spectrum for attack and defense was now a critical element of military operations. No military could function without sophisticated electronic systems for communications, navigation, targeting, and intelligence gathering. And every military needed capabilities to protect its own electronic systems while attacking enemy systems. The principles Jones had established for how to approach such warfare, understand the enemy's systems deeply, develop countermeasures that are subtle and sophisticated rather than crude. Think several moves ahead like a chess player. Balance immediate tactical needs against longer-term strategic intelligence objectives. These principles were still being taught to intelligence officers and electronic warfare specialists decades later. Jones had also demonstrated the strategic value of scientific intelligence. The Cold War was in many ways a competition in technology as much as in military forces or political ideology. Understanding what the Soviet Union was doing in nuclear weapons, missiles, submarines, radar, and later satellites and computers. This intelligence was crucial for Western policymaking and defense planning, and the methodologies for gathering and analyzing such intelligence owed much to Jones's pioneering work. Perhaps most significantly, Jones had shown that individual expertise and judgment still mattered, even in an age of large bureaucracies and committee-driven decision-making. The Battle of the Beams was won because one person understood the problem deeply enough to recognize what was happening, to devise effective countermeasures, and to convince others to act. If Jones had been just another committee member, if his voice had been diluted by bureaucracy, if the system had required extensive approvals and consensus before acting, Britain would have lost the invisible war. There's a lesson there about the importance of empowering experts, of creating systems where people with deep knowledge can make decisions and take action quickly when circumstances require it. Jones died in December 1997 at the age of 86. His obituaries in newspapers around the world described him as one of the unsung heroes of World War II, a scientist whose intellectual weapons had been as important as any physical armaments. But those who had worked with him, who had witnessed his contributions firsthand, knew that even the obituaries didn't capture the full significance of what he had achieved. After Jones's death, further documents were declassified, revealing aspects of his work that had remained secret even after his autobiography was published. These documents showed that Jones's investigations had touched on virtually every aspect of German scientific war-making, not just radio beams and rockets, but also radar development, submarine technology, aircraft design, chemical weapons programs, and yes, nuclear research. In each case, Jones had provided crucial intelligence that informed British and later Allied responses. The full picture that emerged was of a scientific intelligence operation unprecedented in its scope and effectiveness. One particular set of documents, released in the early 2000s, revealed just how close the connection had been between Jones's investigation of Peenemünde and the disruption of German nuclear weapons research. Jones had known during the war that German scientists were working on nuclear fission, that there were research programs exploring uranium enrichment and reactor design. But the full extent of how these programs were integrated with rocket development at Peenemünde and other sites only became clear decades later. German scientists had been pursuing multiple paths toward atomic weapons. One approach involved building research reactors to produce plutonium. Another involved enriching uranium using centrifuges. A third, less developed path explored using beryllium as a moderator in compact reactor designs. And cutting across all of these efforts were theoretical physicists calculating the critical mass needed for weapons, engineering challenges of detonation mechanisms, and delivery system development, which is where rockets came in. Peenemünde was not just a rocket facility. It was a node in a network of research sites working on Germany's most advanced weapons programs. Scientists there were not only developing the V-2 missile, but also consulting on how such missiles might be adapted to deliver different types of warheads, including potentially atomic ones. When Bomber Command struck Peenemünde in August 1943, they disrupted rocket development, but they also disrupted the broader network of advanced weapons research. Scientists were killed or diverted to other tasks. Facilities were damaged. The security of concentration of research at one location was called into question, leading to dispersal of programs that made coordination more difficult. Historical analysis conducted after the Cold War, comparing German nuclear research progress before and after the Peenemünde raid, suggested that the bombing set back their atomic weapons program by perhaps a year. In the actual timeline, Germany never achieved a working atomic weapon before the war ended in May 1945. But if their research had progressed unimpeded, if key personnel hadn't been killed and facilities hadn't been destroyed in 1943, they might have achieved critical breakthroughs in 1944. And if they had succeeded in developing even a primitive atomic bomb by late 1944, the strategic situation would have been transformed. One atomic bomb delivered by conventional bomber or by a V-2 adapted for the purpose could have destroyed an entire Allied army group concentrated for offensive operations. It could have annihilated a major port facility critical for supply lines. It could have devastated London, killing hundreds of thousands and potentially forcing Britain to negotiate. Even without effective delivery systems, German possession of atomic weapons would have created an entirely different calculus for Allied Operation Peenemünde. If the raid hadn't occurred, if German research had continued uninterrupted, is sobering. The chain of causation is complex and involves many factors beyond Jones's individual actions. But it's clear that his scientific intelligence work was a crucial link in the chain of events that prevented the worst-case scenario. Jones himself, learning after the war about the nuclear dimensions of what he had unknowingly helped to disrupt, was characteristically modest about his role. In private conversations with colleagues, he acknowledged that luck had played a part. If the intelligence about Peenemünde had been slightly less specific, if the photographs had been less revealing, if the decision to authorize the raid had gone differently, the outcome might have been very different. But Jones also noted that you make your own luck in intelligence work. By building systems that collected the right kind of information, by training analysts to recognize what was significant, by being willing to follow tenuous leads that others might have dismissed, by pushing for action even when evidence was incomplete, you create the conditions where lucky breaks are possible. The Battle of the Beams had taught Jones to trust his scientific judgment even when confronted with skepticism. That confidence, earned through the successful countering of Knickebein, Excuret, and Weigaret, made him more willing to push for investigation of the rocket intelligence that led to Peenemünde. If he had been more cautious, more deferential to senior officers who dismissed rocket weapons as fantasy, the investigation might not have happened. So the invisible war that began with radio beams and ended with rockets and nuclear implications was all of a piece, a connected campaign of scientific intelligence that shaped the course of World War II in ways that remained hidden for decades. Looking back from the perspective of the 21st century, we can see Jones's work as a hinge moment in the history of warfare. Before Jones, science and technology were important factors in military power, but they were not systematically integrated into intelligence and operational planning. After Jones, it became impossible to imagine modern warfare without sophisticated technical intelligence, electronic warfare, and continuous competition in military technology. The invisible war that Jones fought became the template for how nations would compete throughout the Cold War and beyond. Today's signals intelligence operations, cyber warfare capabilities, satellite reconnaissance, and electronic countermeasures all descend in some way from the principles and practices Jones established. When the United States developed its signals, intelligence capabilities through the National Security Agency, when the Soviet Union built its electronic warfare forces, when every modern military established technical intelligence branches, they were all following paths that Jones had first mapped out in his cramped office in London during the desperate years of 1940 to 1939. Jones's story also illustrates a profound truth about how wars are won. The public narrative of World War II focuses on the battles everyone knows: D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, the Battle of Britain. These were certainly crucial, but there were other battles, invisible ones, fought by people whose names never appeared in newspapers, using weapons of mathematics and physics and engineering. Jones's invisible war against German radio beams saved thousands of lives and protected Britain's ability to resist during the critical period when it stood alone. His intelligence work on rockets disrupted German advanced weapons programs at crucial moments. His contributions to understanding German scientific capabilities informed Allied strategy throughout the war. None of this was visible to the public at the time. Jones couldn't be celebrated as a hero because revealing what he did would have compromised ongoing operations. Even after the war, much of his work remained classified for decades. But the impact was real and significant. The old saying that wars are won by the side that makes the fewest mistakes can be rephrased for the modern era. Wars are won by the side that better understands and exploits technology. And understanding begins with intelligence, with scientific minds that can look at fragmentary evidence and see the shape of threats and opportunities, that can devise creative responses to new challenges, that can think ahead of enemies who are themselves brilliant and capable. Reginald Victor Jones was one of the first and one of the best at this new kind of warfare. His legacy extends far beyond the specific achievements of his wartime service. He showed that science and intelligence were not separate domains, but needed to be integrated. He demonstrated that individual expertise and judgment could be decisive even in massive bureaucratic organizations. He proved that defenders could win against sophisticated attacks if they were smart, adaptive, and willing to think unconventionally. And he taught generations of scientists and intelligence officers who came after him that their work mattered in the most profound sense, that the equations and diagrams and technical analyses they worked on translated directly into human lives saved or lost, freedoms preserved or surrendered, futures shaped by their choices. The woman in Coventry who told Jones to make sure it didn't happen again spoke for countless others who would never know the name of the young physicist who fought an invisible Peenemünde. Through his contributions to scientific intelligence that shaped Allied strategy, he helped ensure that the specific horrors of Coventry were not repeated on the scale they might have been, that Britain survived to become the launching point for liberation, that Nazi Germany's most advanced weapons were disrupted before they could be fully deployed. The invisible beams that Hitler thought would allow systematic destruction of Britain were turned against Germany by a scientist who understood them better than their creators. The rockets that were supposed to be revenge weapons became instead evidence of German desperation. Too little, too late. The nuclear program that might have changed everything was disrupted before it could achieve its goals. And all of this entire campaign of scientific intelligence and electronic warfare and technical investigation, was pioneered by a young man who started the war with no intelligence training, no military background, nothing but a doctorate in physics and an unshakable belief that evidence and reason could overcome any challenge. That's the story of Reginald Victor Jones and the invisible war he fought and won. It's a story about how technology changes warfare, but doesn't change the fundamental importance of human intelligence, creativity, and courage. It's a story about how one person with expertise and determination can change history. And it's a story that reminds us that the most significant battles are sometimes the ones we never see, fought by people whose names we don't know, using weapons we don't understand, in defense of freedoms we take for granted. The crazy antenna that exposed Hitler's biggest secret wasn't crazy at all. It was the product of brilliant scientific analysis, meticulous intelligence work, and sophisticated electronic engineering. It was Jones's weapon in an invisible war, and it helped save a nation that was fighting for its survival against an enemy that seemed, in those dark days of 1940, likely to win. Britain didn't surrender. It survived, and then it fought back, and eventually it won. Many factors contributed to that victory, but one of them hidden for decades and still not fully appreciated, was the work of a young physicist who looked at fragmentary intelligence about radio beams and saw a threat that others dismissed. Who designed countermeasures that turned enemy technology against itself, who followed evidence about rockets and helped disrupt programs that threatened far more than just Britain, and who in doing all of this essentially created modern scientific intelligence and electronic warfare as distinct disciplines. That is the legacy of Reginald Victor Jones, the man who fought Hitler's invisible war and won. When Jones died in 1997, electronic warfare had become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Satellites beamed signals around the globe. Fiber optic networks carried encrypted communications. Computers controlled everything from power grids to financial systems. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a battlefield as important as land, sea, or air. And the principles for fighting in that domain? For protecting friendly systems while attacking enemy ones. For gathering intelligence through technical means while denying it to adversaries. Those principles traced back to the work Jones did in a cramped office in wartime London, analyzing radio beams and designing countermeasures while bombs fell on the city around him. The world Jones left behind in 1997 was vastly different from the one he had entered intelligence work in 1939. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The existential threats that had shaped the second half of the 20th century had receded. But new challenges were emerging. Terrorism, cyber warfare, the proliferation of advanced weapons technology to more actors. And the approaches Jones had pioneered, scientific intelligence, technical analysis, creative countermeasures, thinking ahead of adversaries, these remained as relevant as ever. Intelligence agencies around the world still train their analysts using case studies drawn from Jones's work. The Battle of the Beams is taught as an example of how to approach technical intelligence problems. Jones's methodology, form hypotheses, test them against evidence, revise when necessary, always question assumptions, is considered foundational. And the broader lesson of his career, that expertise matters, that individual judgment and creativity can be decisive, that scientific method has applications far beyond the laboratory, continues to influence how intelligence organizations are structured and how they operate. In universities, physics and engineering students sometimes learn about Jones's work as an example of how their technical knowledge might be applied to real-world problems of enormous significance. The idea that a physicist could become a war hero, not by building weapons but by understanding and countering enemy technology, is inspiring to students who might not otherwise see connections between their studies and broader social importance. In popular culture, Jones's story has been told and retold, though often simplified or dramatized. Films, documentaries, and books have brought the Battle of the Beams to wider audiences. These popular accounts sometimes miss the technical nuances and sometimes overstate Jones's individual role at the expense of the many others who contributed. But they serve an important purpose in reminding the public that World War II, often remembered for its military battles, was also a scientific and technological competition of the highest stakes. And they preserve the memory of a kind of heroism that doesn't fit the traditional mold, quiet, intellectual, secret for decades, but no less real or significant than more visible forms of courage. Jones himself would likely be uncomfortable with some of the hero worship. He was a scientist first, someone who valued accuracy and proper attribution of credit. He always insisted that his wartime achievements were team efforts, that he had been fortunate to work with brilliant colleagues, that luck and timing had played important roles alongside skill and judgment. But history has its own judgment, independent of personal modesty. And the historical judgment on Reginald Victor Jones is clear. He was one of the most important scientific intelligence officers of World War II, and one of the key figures in ensuring that Britain survived its most dangerous period. His work saved thousands of lives, protected critical infrastructure, and bought time for Britain to build the strength needed to eventually win the war. The invisible war he fought was as important as any of the visible battles. And the weapons he created, not physical weapons but methods and techniques and countermeasures, shaped the conduct of conflict for generations after. That is his legacy. Not a single dramatic moment but a sustained campaign of intellectual combat that changed the course of history. When we remember World War II, when we think about how freedom was preserved against totalitarian aggression, we should remember not just the soldiers who fought on battlefields, but also the scientists who fought invisible wars, the code breakers at Bletchley Park who cracked German ciphers, the engineers who developed radar and other defensive technologies, the intelligence analysts who pieced together enemy capabilities from fragmentary evidence. And among those scientists, we should remember Reginald Victor Jones, who looked at reports of impossible radio beams and saw the truth, who designed countermeasures that turned enemy technology against itself, who followed the evidence from beams to rockets to nuclear programs, and who in doing all of this helped save a nation and pioneered new forms of warfare that continue to shape our world. His story deserves to be remembered and told, not as an abstract historical curiosity, but as a living example of how human intelligence, in every sense of that word, can overcome apparently insurmountable challenges. In an age when technology seems to be advancing faster than our ability to understand it, when new threats emerge in cyberspace and elsewhere that seem beyond our capacity to counter, Jones's story is a reminder that human creativity and determination still matter. The problems may change, but the fundamental approach, understand the threat deeply, think creatively about countermeasures, act decisively even with incomplete information, learn and adapt continuously, this approach remains valid. The invisible war continues in different forms. The beams are now data streams and wireless networks. The countermeasures are firewalls and encryption and cyber warfare tools. But the underlying contest, defenders trying to protect critical systems while attackers probe for weaknesses, intelligence agencies trying to understand adversary capabilities while protecting their own secrets. This contest that Jones helped define continues. And the lessons he taught, that expertise matters, that scientific method applies to intelligence work, that creativity and determination can overcome technological disadvantages, that individual contributions can be decisive even in large organizations, these lessons remain relevant. Every intelligence analyst who approaches a hard problem with systematic rigor, every electronic warfare officer who develops creative countermeasures, every scientist who applies technical knowledge to national security challenges is in some sense following the path Jones first mapped. His invisible war was won decades ago, but the methods he pioneered, the standards he set, and the example he provided continue to matter. That is perhaps the most fitting tribute to Reginald Victor Jones, not statues or monuments, but a living legacy of practice and principle that continues to protect freedom and security in an age of ever-advancing technology. The crazy antenna that wasn't crazy, the young physicist who took on the Luftwaffe's most advanced weapons and won, the invisible war that helped save a nation. These are more than historical curiosities. They are reminders of what human intelligence can achieve when it is properly directed, adequately supported, and given the freedom to operate creatively in service of causes larger than itself. That is the story of Dr. Reginald Victor Jones. That is the story of the Battle of the Beams. And that is a story that deserves to be remembered as long as we value freedom, as long as we face technological threats, and as long as we believe that individual excellence and creativity can make a difference in shaping the course of history.